We have already had several tier shifts in Inyu throughout Scarlet and Violet, and there have not been many consistencies, though one of them that has been present is Sandaconda being the best one in the tier. There has not been a single microsecond, I don't care what anyone tries to tell you, that Sandaconda has not been literally the best option in the tier. And that's not to say that it's always been the strongest Pokemon, but it's always been the easiest mon to just justify putting on any team, basically, because of all the different roles that it fulfills in one team slot. We've been enjoying the kind of content we've been doing. If you like competitive Pokemon, you like analysis, you like PS Lives, and you like me dicking around with my friends. Well, so far it's only aim, but you get the idea. Subscribe. Stick around forever. We'll hit 10k, and it'll be glorious. Now, why is Sandaconda so good? Because I think that's an important question to answer before we first talk about the sets. And there's a couple reasons for that, of course. The first one is pretty obvious. It's the only good ground type in the tier, and that's been consistent so far the entirety of the generation. We just haven't had any other options other than like Whiscash and Camerupt, and those are both very, very lacking options. They're very limited in what they can do. They're also just not as good stats-wise for what you want out of a ground type. Meanwhile, Sandaconda is not lacking at all. It's got a lot better durability. It's got a much better just pool of moves. We call that a move pool. It's just more proficient at what it does because it's been given better tools. You know, it's not super weak to status or anything, even though that's not as big of an issue this generation with, you know, Toxic being less common. It's not as vulnerable to chip damage because it has Rest with Shed Skin that gives it an actually really reliable recovery move. And it's not limited to these, like, utility sets that just stick around and do nothing. You've actually got options with Coil Sandaconda to turn it into one of the best setup supers in the tier. Now that's all great and dandy. Alright, so what does a ground type need to do? Well, this is one of the areas where, weirdly enough, the other two are better. Because if you're talking about blocking Volt Switch, Sandaconda's surprisingly bad at that, because all of the electric types very, very easily run a coverage move for it. And, you know, Camerupt and Whiscash don't actually deal with that issue. You know, we've seen in plenty of videos, lead Sandaconda, Jolteon was the other Pokemon, and you just get hit by Terra Blast, Ice, and die. So, that's really the only limiting factor, though. When we look at everything else, Sandaconda does it at the highest of levels. Think about, for example, right now, since we're talking about defensive Pokemon, all of the prevalent physical attackers in Inyu. Let's just go down the list, because this is always the easiest way to showcase it. Bombardier, Braviary, Bruxish, you know, Coil to Dunsparce even, I could say, Floatzel, Mabostiff, Samurai, I guess we could say, Scyther, Hazel, the Tauroses, Croak, Ursaring. Wanna know the common denominator? Sandaconda checks all of them. And I'm saying it checks all of them, I mean the water types too. Because Terastallizing gives you so much leverage over anything that wants to switch into you, and think that it can, you know, take advantage of you offensively as you set up your Stealth Rock. But also, Sandaconda's bulk is kind of weirdly high to the point that these mods have to always go for their super effective coverage. So, like, if I'm a Bruxish versus Sandaconda, and I want to actually, like, you know, not get got by the Sandaconda player out-predicting me, it's just always an awkward turn, because I want to Wave Crash. Because if I go for Psychic Fangs, I ain't KOing. Just isn't happening. But if I go for Wave Crash, what if they Terra Ghost? What if they Terra Dragon? What if they go for Water? And I think that's another big part of why Sandaconda is so good. Terastallizing is really strong on it, because you've got some of those Pokemon I mentioned, of course, like, say, Bruxish, for example, that Sandaconda needs Terra to check, but once it has used its Terra, it's an incredible answer to. So, Hisuian Sneasel and Toxicroak are probably the two most relevant out of the options that I mentioned. And that's because +2 CC from either of them, you know, they're both very common Sword Sand Sweepers, they also run Terra Fighting pretty consistently. That's not something you take very well at all if you're still just a normal ground type. In fact, Toxicroak can one-shot you. I think it may need Stealth Rock damage to guarantee it, but it can one-shot Sandaconda if Sanda doesn't turn into, a Ghost type, or a Fairy type, for example. But with Terrestrializing, obviously it doesn't end up being an issue, and now you wall these Pokemon forever. And it's not even like it's a bad use of it, because turning into a Ghost type doesn't really introduce new weaknesses that you care about. What are in-use Dark types right now? I mean, it's Quillfish, Bombardier, which is almost exclusively running utility sets. It's Umbreon. I mean, we don't have strong Dark types that you really care about anyway, so you're not introducing new weaknesses there. And if you talk about Ghost types, well, the only really relevant one is Rotom. And Rotom beats you anyway, so I mean, whether I'm a ground type or a ghost type, the Mon is sitting on me and beating me, no matter what. So why do I care? This was already bad. It's not like it gets notably worse to where I'm worried. I guess Sableye is another mod you could bring up here, because if it has Foul Play, it's going to do a lot. But Sableye hasn't really been running Foul Play a ton lately. At least in my experience, the most common set is Knockoff, Will-O-Wisp, Encore, and Recover. And conveniently, Sandaconda is viewed as one of the best knockoff absorbers in the tier anyway, and with how, 1, weak Sableye is, and this extends to utility Bombardier as well, and then 2, how bulky Sandaconda is, even if you turn into a ghost type after Terrestrializing, you haven't really introduced any problems. So, now we can talk about the sets more intricately, I suppose. If we're talking about Stealth Rock Sandaconda, it's just all of that roll compression we already mentioned in terms of what it does defensively for a team. Now add in that it can set Stealth Rock, and that's why it's the best rocker in the tier. You already have so much usefulness on defense, you may as well get that little extra bit of utility. And your matchup against common removal, it's not as good as it used to be, but it's also not that bad. I mean, if we're looking at the most common hazard removers, obviously Scyther gets Stone Edged. Lurantis is a weird interaction, because if it is non-terrestrialized, of course it beats you with Leaf Storm. But I'm here to tell you right now, if Lurantis uses that little funny Terra button, usually it's turning into an electric or a fire type. It actually loses to you once it does that, so that's a funny one. Cryogonal has to Terra to beat you, so it's not that bad of a matchup. And it's something like Avalugg, it's not beating you, even with, Sandaconda being incapable of taking Avalugg out on its own. It's okay, because you stall it out with Helmet. So you can keep your rocks up just by virtue of Avalugg being incapable of meaningfully threatening you. And I'm going to reiterate, because I forget if I actually talked about it, Cryogonal is like a pretty bad matchup without Terra. Or, yeah, without Terra for Cryogonal. Like, it's bad for Cryogonal. I'm sorry, I was so confused, I lost track of myself. But Cryogonal with Terra Steel does actually kind of beat Conda, so it's not the worst. And then if we look at historically, I mean, a lot of the removers in you have just been flying types anyway, so they don't... It's hard to say this, because at the time they were okay, because Sandaconda ran Glare so much, instead of Stone Edge. Now it's less clear, so like Oricorio Pom-Pom when we had it. That mod was actually a pretty good defogger, because Sandaconda, even if it had Stone Edge, wasn't doing that much, and it always had to be cautious of Terra Grass Revelation Dance. Same with something like Oricorio Bale, where it always has to be worried about Stone Edge, but to a much greater margin. But if you're Terra Grass, or even Terra Ground, okay, well, you at least patch that weakness up. And in Braviary is probably, like, the most consistently tough matchup, I would say, that Sandaconda has had. Defog Braviary didn't really pick up until more recently, but it saw occasional use early on, just given how bad the pool of defoggers was in the wake of Oricorio Pom-Pom's ban multiple months ago. And I mean, yeah, Stone Edge doesn't do much. You don't care that much if you get glared. You just kind of wall Sanda forever. It's just another case kind of like Avalugg, where you don't do a lot back, and you may just end up self-KOing due to recoil. And we mentioned Terra types, of course Ghost's the most common. Another very fun one, of course, anything that makes you resist water, so like you got both water and dragon. These are very helpful into rain teams, and physical water types like Bruxish and Samurott. Another one though is Terra Fairy, and I particularly like this if you're running this set, I don't know when this video is going up as of recording it, but the Dunsparce is still in the tier. And of course Electros is in the tier. And this set's kind of interesting because you actually just beat both of them. Electros is of course more awkward, because you can't actually hit it with a move. But you do stall it out, from what I've been told, pretty consistently. And of course the Dunsparce, I mean, it's just going to come down to who crits who, but you at least match up about as well as anything else is going to. And back when Grimmsnarl was in the meta, y'all remember me running lots of this because you just... It was like the most consistently splashable mon to check bulk up Grim. So, I think since we're talking about Coil now, we can segue very nicely into the Coiler. Because Sandaconda has been consistently one of the easiest mons, I feel, for me to get wins with. Because it's so good. You turn into a dragon type, like every relevant weakness you had, other than ice, just goes away. You hit Appleton now, super effectively, with Dragon Rush. Oh, it's beautiful. It's just so beautiful. And you're still so bulky. You still provide a lot of the utility that you did on the utility set. Like, you're still super bulky. You still get chip on U-turn. You still get to absorb status. And also, I mean, hey, you can run Stealth Rock Blissey in this current metagame and you get a really good defensive core, because of course Sandaconda, really, really bulky physically. Blissey, really, really bulky specially. There's just a lot to like from that. And of course, too, you've got other options. So like Stone Edge, you could run over Dragon Rush and then go Terra Fairy. That's probably the other adaptation that I would consider to the set, because then you get a better matchup against opposing Coil Pokemon like Dun and Eel. And of course, with this set, since we actually get 2 attacks, you're able to take on Eel 1v1 at least. Now, they run Terra Steel, but I'm going to tell you right now, that mon ain't beating you down. You Terra Fairy, it is going to self-KO before you really are all too worried. But I think that's going to be it. I think, really, the summary to take from the video is this. Sandaconda not only manages to blanket check a million Pokemon in the tier, but it does that while offering a ton of other utility to your team, as well as being pretty hard to take advantage of, just because it has enough set versatility, even just like move versatility, to cheese past a couple of its checks. You know, Appleton even has to be worried about Dragon Rush. Rotom doesn't want to take a ton of Stone Edges as it switches in, because that will weaken it over time. Even something like an Electros. Stone Edge is going to not do a ton. It does like around 20%. But hey, over time, maybe there's Stealth Rock up. Maybe I get a crit, because Stone Edge has a high crit ratio. And, you know, Electros doesn't have good recovery anyway, so maybe I'm putting a little bit too much pressure on you to hold up. All of this just combines really, really well, in addition to Conda being the only viable ground type, to make it the best, undisputedly the best, Pokemon in NU. I hope y'all enjoyed this. I will see you all in the next video. Peace.